Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. What can you say about a country whose economy results in a problem of obesity in fetuses? All right, Stacey Herbert, tell us more.
Max, I'm sure you're referring to the pill that they now give pregnant women in order to make sure their fetuses are not obese. But we're going to look at how a situation like that develops, where there's just too much of everything. And we're going to roll back to December 21st, 2011. Bernanke money policy seen successful as savers become consumers. And they say that Federal Reserve Chairman Ben S. Bernanke finally may be catching a break. His easy money policies are showing signs of speeding up the economic rebound 3 years after he cut interest rates to zero. And the article cites the fact that the housing market and the car sales market, that looks like it's reviving a bit.
Well, the savings rate has plunged again. Back to zero. So America has no savings, which means that they're entirely reliant on the state for government handouts. There's no formation of capital amongst the citizens to give them independence and freedom outside of their dependence on the state. Bernanke understands that. He's a communist dressed up like a capitalist.
But the mainstream financial media, as this article points out, makes it sound like it's a very great result of Ben Bernanke's zero interest rate policies, okay? They quote Alan Sinai, co-founder and chief global economist and strategist at Decision Economics in New York, who says, when the Fed sprinkles happy dust on the economy, we always respond. The happy dust has been out there a long, long time, and I think it finally may be settling in some places.
It's not happy dust, it's angel dust. It's PCP, and they're snoring it mainline up their schnazulas. And this is causing, of course, people to be, number one, dependent on the state, number two, drug-addled, so that they don't notice they're dependent on the state.
Well, he calls it happy dust, but it's only a certain segment of the population that is actually happy with this. And that is those who are sponges on the system, who don't actually contribute to the economy over the long term, perhaps the short term on one local area like Wall Street, and they might use the happy dust of zero interest rate policy to stoke a bubble in, say, Groupon shares that lasts all of, 3 or 4 months.
I think people have to understand that this term happy dust is code for counterfeiting or confetti. And what Ben Bernanke has done by keeping interest rates at essentially 0% is that he has made it easy for central banks and banks to endogenously, as the term goes in economics, create money, leverage that they use to buy stuff, and as a result of this Ponzi scheme, the value of that stuff goes up, including the bond market, and this has been going on for 30 years until the bond market collapses, and it's only a matter of time. Some would argue within the next 6 months, we'll have the end of the 30-year bond market and a collapse in the bond market or asset prices, and the Ponzi scheme like Groupon stock, which we've warned about on this show. We said Henry Blodgett over at Business Insiders, his whole case for Groupon was flawed. In fact, that we were right, he was wrong. It's just another Ponzi scheme.
Okay, so we should mention that Groupon shares have fallen sharply since you mentioned that. But let's move on back to our main topic here, Max, because we're talking about this happy dust that the Federal Reserve Bank has sprayed all across the global economies. And they say they maintain that everybody's happy. So we're going to go look at some headlines where people aren't happy at all. BRICS summit. Emerging economies condemn military threats against Iran, Syria. So leaders of the 5 world's fastest growing economies called Thursday for an end to the rhetoric of military action against Iran and Syria as they met in India to develop measures to boost mutual trade in their local currencies. So the 5 leaders of the BRICS nations, of course, are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they were very vocal, including like close allies like India. Indian Prime Minister Singh said we must avoid political disruptions that create volatilities in global energy markets and affect trade flows. And this is in response to the threats against Iran and Syria. But they do also go on to suggest that a central bank for these BRIC nations and an alternative to the US dollar.
Yeah, well, this will create competition for the US dollar. And our guest in the second half of the show, Jim Rickards, will go into this because his book Currency War details this. He predicted this would be the case. It is, in fact, happening. And the dollar, as the currency used in, at one point, it was 70% of all global transactions. That's just continuing to go down and down and down. And this takes away the U.S. barrier from competition, which is destroying the U.S. competitiveness more than it's already been destroyed.
Well, so let's see what they say. The 5 leaders signed a pact that they hope will reduce the demand for fully convertible currencies such as the dollar for trade among BRICS nations. The agreement will allow credit in local currencies among BRICS export-import banks to boost trade. The internal trade among the BRICS nation, now at $230 billion, is growing at an average of 28% a year, and the coalition hopes to increase it to $500 billion by 2015. And the article then goes on to quote, Max, Rajiv Kumar, Secretary General of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, and he says the BRICS group is trying to tie 5 boats together in the midst of an enormous global economic storm. They are trying to hedge their bets by promoting trade among themselves and creating a fallback plan in case the dollar-denominated global trade falls apart in the future.
It's in motion. It's on go. It's happening. And the currency wars are with us. And, of course, Russia has blue gold in the form of natural gas they bring to the party. China's got $3 trillion in reserves, $1 trillion US dollars that they need to rejigger in the global economies.
And so this action here, where they're tying their boats together to prepare for the fact that the US dollar will no longer be the reserve currency. And remember, all of America's trade, all of their deficit is with these countries, in fact. So if they're saying we're going to divorce ourselves from the US dollar, let's look back to right before this meeting when Brazilian Trade and Industry Minister Fernando Pimentel accused the rich nations of causing a monetary tsunami by engaging in expansionist policies such as low interest rates and bond buying programs. So Max, we go back again to this happy dust, this angel dust. These guys are high, and when somebody's high, when they're drunk, they think that they are cool, that they're slurring their words and falling all over the place makes them look sexy, where every sober person at the party looks at them like they're some jerk, you know, standing naked, like swinging around their hat on a table at a party.
Yeah, those are the BRICS regarding Bernanke.
Exactly. The Bernanke, they also mentioned Europe. They specifically mentioned the euro, and they're printing money. So these are the major trade partners. These are the guys in charge of the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO. And they say these guys are stoned on angel dust.
Well, this is where the U.S. consumer is doubly screwed because they're dependent on the Fed, but the Fed is dependent on the creditor nations for buyers of their securities, of their bonds. So as that chain breaks apart, the U.S. government collapses, the Bernanke's friends collapse, but then the consumer collapses doubly hard.
They also mentioned that they're going to try to form a competitor to the World Bank because, of course, they provide all the capital that is backing basically all the derivatives and all the fraud across Europe, the Eurozone, America, all these debts, all these student debts that can't be paid, all these mortgage debts that can't be paid across all those economies. And here's a tweet from Jim Rickards regarding this proposed banks. He says, if BRICS start bank as planned, will BRICS currency be far behind? Geithner out to trash US dollar. He's getting his wish.
Right. Well, you know, here's a fundamental point to keep in mind. Since the end of World War II, the reason the U.S. has gotten away with this idea of being the world's reserve currency is that they have outsourced their military effectively to the allies of America. But what India is saying and what these other countries are saying is that they no longer agree with America's foreign policy. They no longer agree with the Pentagon's occupation of these countries in their neighborhood and around the world. So therefore, to cut off funding, to do the thing that the American people should have done a long time ago, they are going to do what America can't do for itself. Cut the Pentagon off from its primary source of funding by borrowing money from these foreign creditors. And they're doing so because of this very subtle and fundamental shift of around the world. They see America, the Pentagon, as being protectionist to being a threat. That's what's happened in the last 3 years. And that's the number one reason the US dollar is going to collapse.
So let's move on then to other people who are furious and not very happy at this wild party, the bacchanalia going on at the Fed and the Treasury. Chart, why savers are furious in America. So the savings rate is back to collapsing. Here's another fun one. Check out income earned from interest as a percentage of GDP. Of course, is a fun chart to the guys at Business Insider. Joe Wiesenthal thinks this is funny. And as you see, that the income from savings has collapsed.
Yeah, well, that's a financial repression that happens when banks are in bed fascistically with the central banks and corporations, so that savers and workers are subsidizing Joe Wiesenthal's paycheck. If it wasn't for savers, Joe Wiesenthal would be selling hot dogs in Times Square to people coming out of the garden after being drunk on a basketball or soccer or a hockey game, and he'd have to get a real job instead of just tweeting all day.
Well, so let's look at the numbers as well, because 41% of early boomers and 48% of late boomers, and these guys are all about to retire, do not have enough income to retire. So if their savings is collapsing and their earnings from their savings is collapsing, we have another crisis on our hands coming up in the next decade for sure.
Well, I see Goldman Sachs is finally divesting itself out of that prostitution ring it's been invested in for a number of years. They shouldn't divest so quickly because a lot of those bankers are going to need to make a living somehow.
So let's move on to a final one, joining the Bacchanali. So I showed you some headlines where some people, importantly, they're our primary trading partners, okay, and have all of the capital in the world. They're very angry with the angel dust, the happy dust that Ben Bernanke has sprayed all over the financial system, the monetary system. Now let's look at somebody else who's going, that you start on a soft drug like the happy dust and you have to go up to the next. You have to start doing bigger and stronger lines. Even a €1 trillion firewall wouldn't be enough. So we know about the €800 billion European stability mechanism. Well, German Chancellor Angela Merkel and her finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble have been accused of crossing many of the red lines that they have set for themselves over the course of the euro crisis, making U-turn after U-turn as the crisis escalated. They officially stepped over the latest red line on Friday when European finance ministers meeting in Copenhagen agreed to boost the scope of the Eurozone's firewall to over €800 billion. Berlin had long rejected such an expansion out of hand. So Max, red lines, doing U-turn after U-turn, walking in circles, what does that remind you of?
Well, it's obviously that Bernanke's happy dust is a gateway drug to red lines. Red lines of LTRO. The Bolivian marching powder is back, and it's in Berlin, and Angela Merkel is getting zooted on an expansion of the firewall dust up her nostrils. And it doesn't help the cognitive abilities much. She's beginning to sound less and less coherent as days go by, but that's what angel dust, Bernanke's dust will do to you. Stacey Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, don't go away. Much more coming away, including Jim Rickards.